So in addition to the seemingly voracious pace of military operations these days, one of the biggest things being talked about at the Pentagon is reform, and basically in three key areas. We're talking structural reform. So we've seen Congress and the Pentagon now taking a look at Goldwater-Nichols. We've seen personnel reform in Secretary Carter's Force of the Future, and there's been medical and pay and benefits type reforms as well. And lastly, acquisition reform, in which finally we saw some legislation this year that's actually just been written into law. So just to start off, we have a great panel here with us today. As mentioned, Phil Carter, Director of Military Veterans and Society Programs at CNAS, Mackenzie, Eaglen from the American Enterprise Institute, Steve Ondra, retired Army Battlefield Doc and Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer of Healthcare Service Corporation, and retired General Craig McKinley, the CEO and President of NDIA and former Director of the National Guard Bureau. So thank you all for joining us today. So I'm just going to throw some questions out to the panel. Nothing really specific for any of you. Any of you can go after this first one. So what are we trying to accomplish with all of these different types of reforms? What, I guess, are the major benefits that would come to the military from tackling reforms in these three key areas?
I'll jump in. So basically, there was a tide that turned about 7 or 8 years ago when the Republican Party threw out its role as the white knight for defense hawks everywhere and the defense top line. And the Republican Party said, we're not going to prop it up unilaterally or artificially anymore. And so then you saw what we see today. But it manifested long before the Tea Party, long before even this president took office. There were challenges within the GOP about concern about larger federal spending and other priorities like poverty that are taking sort of top attention of policymakers. And so that sort of began the fraying of the national security consensus. The rise of the libertarian moment with the Tea Party, and of course the left and the right started combining. We saw not just the products of this, like the Budget Control Act to start the defense drawdown in 2010, but we also saw them coming together as a voting majority of Congress with the Barney Frank and Mick Mulvaney amendment, for example, to cut defense. And that's really been the state of this issue for almost a decade. So why is it reform, reform, reform all the time, even though it's probably the most dull topic you're going to cover today? Not because we aren't interested in it, and you aren't interested in it, meaning dull, relatively speaking, who wouldn't much rather talk about the third offset. There isn't an additional dollar for defense anymore for the foreseeable future without a reform agenda.
And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish, is to give the Department of Defense flexibility. We've talked about innovation and new strategies and lubricant a little bit today, but the real lubricant is money. And without a certain level of reform in a variety of sectors, there simply won't be the money. We'll talk later, I'm sure, about healthcare has gone from 6% to 10% of the DoD budget. When one of every $10 is going to healthcare, you certainly want to deliver on the faith to our fighting force, but we have to do that in a more efficient way. And so it's like, and that will give more flexibility in terms of budget dollars to the Department of Defense to do everything else we're talking about today.
And I certainly agree with my colleagues that Dave Melcher's in the crowd and I, who represent industry, want to make sure that we understand the playing field, understand what's out there in terms of modernization and recapitalization. Some of the acquisition reform that was enacted last year was a positive step, but like everything else, we've got to continue to go further. For 15 years, we've been involved in counterinsurgency operations. You heard Chief of Staff Milley say that may not be the next war that we need to plan for. So this is a wonderful time to have these discussions, and I commend CNAS for putting this panel together.
We'll go back to medical in just a minute. Let's start with structural. Let's talk about some of the Goldwater-Nichols drills, let's say, that are being done by both the Senate and in the Pentagon. It seems every few years or so, journalists like myself will write a story about changing COCOM lines and merging NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM and European Command and Africa, and people will debate this. So what are some of the major structural reforms that the Pentagon can benefit from?
So I would jump in, and I think I'd flip your question on its head by first starting, what are the problems we're trying to solve? Reforms are simply good ideas in search of a problem, and I think when we start with the reform, we do it backwards. You know, we have certain problems in the force that are apparent after 15 years of war. Speed is one. It took us 3 or 4 years, depending on how you count, to go from the invasion of Iraq to a successful strategy in Iraq. We can't afford a 3 or 4 year reaction time for our military to innovate operationally and tactically on the ground. The same is true on the acquisition side. Speed is not a success or a virtue of our acquisition system. So that's a problem we could fix through acquisition reform. It's a problem we could fix through command reform, better linkage of the schoolhouses to our combatant commands, flattening of combatant commands, and so forth. But that problem to reform linkage is where I'd start. On the personnel side, candidly, I think this is where the Force of the Future effort has stalled. There has not been a successful case made yet for the problems we are trying to solve, whether they're cost, recruiting, quality, or the need to develop intellectual capital for the interwar period. And so until we start with the problem statement and build, maybe not consensus, but at least agreement, we're going to be searching for good ideas without an anchor.
What's interesting, Marcus, is if you read Senator McCain and Senator Reid, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and ranking member, their background memo for this Goldwater-Nichols hearing effort, I think it's a 9 or 10 part series, they swear they're not a solution in search of a problem. However, I don't know that they've fully explained exactly what it is. I can tell you, knowing the chairman, that this really goes back to a lot of the things that were identified in the 2010 QDR independent panel and things we already know as evidence from the acquisition reform that we saw in this year's NDAA, which is there is a widespread belief that there has been disproportionate growth in civilian defense manpower. That includes contractors, federal contractors who provide services to the Defense Department, but it also, of course, includes government civilians. And it also includes uniformed personnel who are assigned and tasked out and basically never come back, but the chief loses them, whether that's to a task force that never stands down or a COCOM or something else. There's also a belief that the services over time, partly because of Goldwater-Nichols, have lost some of their core authorities, and OSD has become too centralized and powerful, and that the services need to regain some of some authority from, or new authority, not necessarily, it wouldn't look like the past. So these are some of the challenges I think they're trying to fix, but have not yet articulated.
Yeah, I agree that defining the problem statement is critical in moving us forward. Some of my fellow service chiefs, I think, got a little bit scared up front to see some of the initiatives that weren't fully vetted, that weren't fully disclosed. And that's going to be trouble as we go into the last year of this administration. How many new things can we digest as we get ready for the next administration?
General McKinley, that's a great point you brought up. There's about 13 months left in this administration. We're going into a presidential election year, and this is a really ambitious agenda that's out there. What is reality that any of this could even get, any of this can get implemented?
Well, I think the discussions frame the problems fairly well. I think coming from a uniform background, the Department of Defense has unique problems right now. They're fighting a very vicious enemy. We've been fighting a counterinsurgency for 15 years. That doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. And yet we've got all these other issues that Chief of Staff of the Army, Milley, pointed out. That once over the world should give us all pause that we have a lot of work to do. But the folks in the Pentagon are going to get the job done day by day. But many of these ideas are going to be long-term, midterm to long-term, not necessarily overnight solutions.
General, I'll stick with you for one more on structural issues. One of the big things that the Pentagon has been trying to do since Bob Gates has been around was to kind of shrink the sizes of its offices, shrink that, as Arnold Panaro likes to call it, the back office. What for you, when you were in the Pentagon, what made that so challenging for you to actually implement?
Well, I think a lot of the panelists have talked about culture today, and the culture of the services, the culture of the civilian workforce, the culture of the leadership. Very hard to change that culture of divesting of significant portions of staffs that have been built up over time. Even a small organization like the National Guard, our large bureau grew from 450 people in the early 80s to almost 4,000 people here in Washington. Now, those are people that have been taken out of the states. The governors don't have those people working day to day for natural disaster or emergency. So it just happens over time, and it's going to take a very decisive leader who watches the shell game of personnel, where you move people, to make sure that they do shrink the staffs, because it's very important to do it.
Mackenzie, I wanted to ask you, the British just finished this big strategic defense and security review, and it kind of, I guess it's kind of akin to the QDR that we do here, or the strategy review that led into the defense strategic guidance. One of the things that struck me about this review is it actually pointed to specific platforms and equipment that they wanted to buy, which our strategy reviews tend to do less of. Is it time that the Pentagon possibly looks at something like that, a review of that kind of scale, to maybe tackle some of these issues and to maybe get away from some of these fragmented efforts?
I think so, and I think no one said it better than Michelle Flournoy last week in her testimony for the Armed Services Committee about how the process of generating the Quadrennial Defense Review has become very watered down on the lowest common denominator consensus building effort, and which yields a product that's pretty weak. Most of us dismiss it, rightly so, including, I think, people who helped write it, because there's a little piece of it for everyone in it, and it lacks a lot of clarity or prioritization. I think the SESR is really well done, and I think partly because it's a shift in where the last review went, and so partly because of what it says. But I agree with you, the comprehensive nature of it is admirable. They also tackle different issues like civilian manpower and Army and strength as well. I do think there's some value in starting to name names because in procurement and in the future. Partly because anybody who just spends 2 minutes looking at the defense budget can figure out what DoD officials and senior Pentagon leaders won't say. But we all know, for example, I'll just put it out there, the Joint Strike Fighter is absolutely 100% unaffordable as it is at $24.43. Those are the facts, the math doesn't lie. But for political reasons and program stability and projecting that to allies and to keep per unit costs down, et cetera, partly because of decisions made under previous secretaries of defense that made this program too big to fail, that there are no alternatives to it. For a lot of reasons, this program is politically protected. It's also a capability that we need. However, there's some challenges in terms of what can be done, particularly as the nuclear triad comes online, and that wedge is huge. It's eye-popping, it's stark, it's a wake-up call, I believe Mr. McCord called it, and it starts next year in the budget in 2017. It will get up to 8% of the defense top line. The defense top line is flat, even with modest growth when you account for special defense inflation adjusters. We have a flat defense budget. If something's gonna come in that's now 0% of it, roughly speaking, or probably 1, and consume 8% of it in the next 15 years, and you have a flat budget, well, that's gonna come from everything else. And so it's probably time to, no better time to do it in the last year of an administration when you can basically say what's on your mind. That's not gonna happen with this administration, but perhaps with the new one.
So Steve, we'll go over to you. You're talking about those flat defense budgets. One of the areas that continually grows every year, and one of the things that acquisition officials like to point out, because it's crowding, taking money away from them, is healthcare and the defense growth there. Why is the healthcare budget growing so rapidly?
Sure. And the important thing to remember is, this is a problem that the whole nation is facing. The Department of Defense is facing it at a faster pace than the private sector. And so one may ask, why is that? Why is the cost of healthcare rising in the DoD faster than the private sector? Some of it's the cost of war, but you certainly can't explain it all from that. In fact, you can't explain much of it. So I don't want to spurt out a bunch of facts that can come in a paper, but let me spurt out one fact. Or maybe two. I talked earlier that the budget has risen from 6% of total DoD to 10%. But when you look at that, only about 15% of that healthcare is for active duty. When you look at retirees and beneficiaries of retirees, it's gone from 60% of them choosing TRICARE to 85%. Why that's important is it suggests that there's something happening in that benefit package that is becoming more attractive than what's comparable in the private sector. So we've made some choices in government and in the department that have made our benefit structure a little bit out of line with the private sector. And that may be a rational choice, but it's only rational if you increase the overall defense budget by the same amount. Otherwise, you're eroding the national security budget. So, you know, the problems that the private sector faces in healthcare costs erode margin for a business. The problems that the Department of Defense is facing in healthcare costs is eroding national defense budgets. And so a more serious problem. And so we need to take a look at what have we done that has caused that shift in benefits. What can we do to increase efficiency? Everything from optimizing the utilization of our military treatment facilities, which are much more cost effective than purchased care when that's an option. That's not the sole option, but it's part of it. So you have benefit design. You can look at how do we pay in the private sector, leveraging some of the work that's been done in alternative payment models in both the Department of Defense, public sector through CMS, and in the private sector. Our company is committed to having 75% of all of our contracts in some sort of fee-for-value model by 2020. And the reason that we're doing that is it's a great way to improve value, not just lower cost, but improve quality, because you want to do both to keep faith with the fighting force. There's a whole long list of things, of specific things that you can go through, but you can take all of them to actually bring the cost of defense health care more in line with the general rise of inflation and more in line with this percentage originally. You know, when TRICARE, one more example, when TRICARE first came up like in the mid-90s, about 27% of its cost was covered by some sort of premium or copay or something. That's down to 11%. So we're actually, and that's just one more example of how we've spread benefit but not increased the DoD budget. We're driving a behavior that is different. That's why utilization is higher among DoD beneficiaries than in the private sector, because you kind of get what you incent, and we're creating no incentive to seek high value. So there's a whole number of things that we can do. And again, the point of all this is to keep our faith with the fighting force, give them what they need in terms of health care, give them that benefit, but do it in a way that's efficient enough to control the cost to maintain flexibility of budget for the Department of Defense overall.
Phil, move over to you. How do you sell all this? It's especially the personnel and these healthcare type reforms. It just appears that you know, if you throw base closures in there, even every one of these seems like a complete third rail when it comes to Congress. How do you end up selling it?
Well, I wish I had a political strategy in here that could help sell them, but I don't. What I can say, though, is that cost is an important issue, particularly on the personnel side. It's not the only issue. You know, the per service member cost in our military has gone up about 178% since the first Gulf War. But cost issues don't resonate, and they don't trump the very effective and very powerful groups in Congress and in Washington that stand up for people. You have to make the total argument. And so there are other issues, other problems that we see with the all-volunteer force. The need to develop intellectual capital in the interwar period is one. And this resonates a lot with service chiefs that look at people like Marshall and Patton and Bradley and say, yeah, how do we create the next generation of those men and women who will fight our military 20 or 30 years from now? The waste of the current system, the extent to which it just casts off people because we have this cyclical all-volunteer force that every year discharges 250,000 people at a rapid rate. No private company in the world would survive if it was as wasteful with manpower as our Defense Department. The geographic and political representation of the force is another problem that we have to solve, and there are others. And so making this holistic argument and doing it all at once and not just piecemealing. You know, Mackenzie, to borrow one of your lines from last week, we tried to do retirement reform and compensation reform, but we took the carrot out and we did that. We did the 401k benefit for our troops, which is great. But in doing so, the stick we never got passed. We never got the important healthcare reforms, the important personnel reforms passed. And now good luck getting it through Congress with that carrot gone, because Congress is all about carrots and not about sticks.
At this point, we're going to turn to the audience. We have about 15 minutes left or so. Please let us know if you have any questions. Just identify yourself. We have one right in the middle, in the back.
Benjamin Carroll, Headquarters Air Force. With regard to defense reform and the services, Could you describe what you think the services need to keep and what we need to get rid of or change so that way we can move forward on defense reform and third offset?
Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I would say that most service chiefs like General Milley and others, General Welsh, CNO Richardson, Commandant Neller, and our chairman who will be here after lunch, are certainly looking at what kinds of things they need to divest. From the Air Force perspective, there's a number of Air Force officers in here. I think our Air Force chief made the case that we might want to get rid of an old airplane, an old airframe, so that we can move into new. Unfortunately, it ran into constituencies in Congress that didn't allow that to happen. There's this give and take. I think the service chiefs know the situation they're in while they're fighting this counterinsurgency war that's very deadly and consuming a lot of resources. But it's difficult to get to an end state while you're in the midst of a major conflict. And this is after 15 years of this. So I think we're going to have to do more of that. I think discussion of having a future BRAC is on the table. Members of Congress may not support that either. And then getting back to the earlier question, there's constituencies that represent each of our military services and the industrial base. And so we have a wonderful check and balance system of arguing cases, but I will give credit to Secretaries Hagel, Panetta, and Carter for trying to inform the defense-related associations on the urgency of changing, on the urgency of adopting new principles. Because before that, we were all kind of left to our own inclinations to support our members, which we know at this time we've got to get beyond our membership. So that's just a quick and dirty answer.
I would say three things: awareness, unity, and continuity, and I'll briefly touch on each. Awareness insofar as the service chiefs have been protected for so long until the strategic choices and management review was undertaken by the previous Secretary of Defense. And they were protected from what? $60 billion going into healthcare annually for DoD. It's not part of their budget. So they didn't see the train wreck coming in personnel costs. They didn't see the trend lines or the math as urgent as, frankly, a lot of us on the outside and even some members of Congress. So there needs to be more awareness of what it costs to operate as a service, and DHP is part of that, period, end of story. Unity, there's an increasing concern among policymakers. They sense weakness from things that are coming out of the Pentagon. When you have an ambitious set of proposals as are coming out in the final year of an administration, when really the conversations are turning to the next one already, you need to have unity, and there's a whiff of disunity, whether that's Force of the Future or a couple of other recently announced initiatives. And then continuity. Whoever comes in next, who's ever the next boss, so to speak, the chair, the next SecDef, next president, the chiefs are going to have to want to see through and carry through what they consider is most important, whatever they get behind. So if they want, for example, let's just, again, take Force of the Future. If they want it to succeed, they're going to have to make it succeed in the next administration, or it will die, regardless of its good intentions.
A bit of an orthogonal response, which is auditability. Right now, the services can't see with enough clarity where to cut. This has been a major initiative and a major problem for the Defense Department for years. One the Marines thought they had solved until they learned they had not. But the Defense Department needs to be auditable. It needs to be legible. You have to be able to see the fully burdened cost of a service member, the fully burdened cost of a civilian, and be able to evaluate the trade space between. You need to know how much operations broadly construed are costing, IT systems, et cetera. And until the department does that, it cannot evaluate how to do business more efficiently, let alone where to make those cuts. And we run the risk of also doing things that are penny wise and pound foolish for the long term, like divesting institutional base or generating base functions and contracting them out, but losing the cultural value or the other value of keeping those in-house. And so auditability is the thing the service chiefs and the service secretaries ought to be pushing harder than they are.
Steve, anything to add?
I think that this has been well said, and it applies to health, and the ability to not only develop an OSD strategy, but then to have accountability and the tools to implement that strategy, which, again, always gets down to the budget.
Questions? Really? There we go.
It's a hungry crowd.
Yep.
Thank you. Karina Robinson, a U.S. Army veteran. Mackenzie, you talked about the politics and how hard it is to reconvince Congress to do things in a timely manner. And it is a Republican administration, very heavy. Do you think that maybe we'll have more progress after the upcoming election?
If there's a Republican, is that what you mean?
Well, just anything.
Yeah. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the fraying of the national security consensus in the middle on both sides, and that it doesn't resurrect itself if a Republican wins the White House or if it doesn't, if a Democrat wins. It's a challenge, and frankly, both parties have to really care. If they care about defense, they should care about that critical middle that's now missing. It will take time to rebuild. We do lack the sense of a common threat, which nobody wishes for a return of the Cold War, but it's partly what gave us that consensus. Now, I think, depending on leaders would say ISIS is most immediate, Russia's most dangerous. I tend to agree with that. I assume that they're right. But I don't know where the American people are, and I think on matters of these questions, they always need to be led. And they need to be led by the person with the bully pulpit, and that person is the commander-in-chief. So if the next president invests in making this a priority, they can certainly rebuild the middle, and I'm optimistic about progress being made. Because defense, even if everyone in this room is happy with the status quo, with reform, if you just want to buy the status quo, the military that we have today, keep it healthy, invest in the people, start to upgrade the triad, keep reform efforts going, it still requires more money than the budget's projected, all things equal. And so it's in both parties' interest to want to rebuild this consensus. You're never going to win over everybody. That's okay. It's a fact of life. But I think the fringes have had too loud of a megaphone for too long. So there's work to be done. And the first step, I think, is that there needs to be an awareness in Washington among the communities that care about defense that this happened. And now it's our responsibility to help talk about it and talk about the rebuilding.
Yeah, I don't want to minimize the effect on the industrial base too. These are tough times that they're going through, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to be 3, 5, 10 years down the line. You know, the consolidation has happened. Maybe more of that's in the future, but I think Frank Kendall's done a great job in articulating the need for a strong industrial base. All we have to do is go back to the end of World War I when we found that we were only using other people's equipment to fight that war. We don't need to ever go back to a point where our servicemen and women have to fight with even equipment that's even on parity with other countries. So I think we have to keep that in the equation too as we look at the political agenda going forward.
I mean, it's interesting. There is something of a consensus that exists, but it might not be on the right thing. So we have a consensus around the all-volunteer force. We've had it for 43 years. It's been a wonderful innovation in the military, but it's also very costly. The costs of this force are things we generally have consensus of. Any effort to adjust compensation, retirement, healthcare runs into that consensus, even if it's rationally supportable, even if it's putting pressure on the rest of the defense budget. The consensus is so strong that neither the SecDef nor the service chiefs nor Congress can overcome it. But there's no consensus for reconciling that with the other things we want to do in a zero-sum budget environment where revenue means, call them tax raises, are anathema to the current Congress. And so something's got to give. The consensus locks in the status quo. And without some ability to take that apart and possibly rebuild a new one, we're in a world of hurt. And as long as this consensus locks us into the current status quo, we can't imagine constructive or negative change, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, the combination of challenges we face and economic constraints means that this is a moment that whoever the next president is, who's ever in Congress, it's going to be a moment of the need for real courage to do exactly what we've been talking about all morning, to innovate and to also reform. Because without those two things, we will not have the budget to do everything that we need to do. And there's not the ability to increase the defense budget to the level it would do to simply increase it. And so if you're in that zero-sum game, it's going to take the real courage to do the two things that we're talking about right now. And if we don't do that, we're going to erode the economic ability to preserve our national security infrastructure.
Any other questions right here in the front?
Cameron Luthi, Bloomberg Government. So if there's this impasse, and there has been for some time, on making these types of reforms, isn't it time to come up with some different approaches? BRAC, we can't do another BRAC the way we used to do it. We probably are going to have to do something that involves public-private partnerships, enhanced use, lease authority, some way to preserve jobs. Otherwise, Congress is going to say no. The personnel reforms, you made a good point. We gave away the carrot, now we don't have the stick. But maybe we need to reformulate the solutions because the traditional reform approaches are stuck in the mud.
I agree. So let me just take BRAC as an example. Totally agree that you don't want to be the definition of insanity, right? So, and BRAC is certainly one of those that symbolizes that. Having lived through that so painfully, ever so painfully in 2005, working for a member of Congress from New England, the entire Defense Department basically tried to pull out of New England regionally, which was just its own flawed decision. But this is a state that is highly dependent upon the federal government, for better or worse. And the Navy wanted to close every installation in Maine, some through the BRAC process, also others through private efforts, like a one shipyard acquisition strategy for destroyers, nonetheless putting the entire livelihood of the state at risk, and therefore Mackenzie's entire personal life. So it was painful, and it was ugly, and it became clear through the commission that the Defense Department cooked the books on some things and didn't have this most sound analysis. The ghosts of that BRAC, which are misperceived as a base closure round when it was primarily realignment, we all know, are long-living, even for members that have left, like Joe Lieberman. And they're not going to go away. But something I learned in that process, actually I should say something the politician I worked for learned, was very important. So, here we are fighting for these installations, the highest paying employer in the entire state. Good jobs, highly skilled, professional, many blue collar, lots of white collar jobs. The next largest employer was the grocery chain. These are jobs they wanted to keep in the state. But something that shocked the senator was we'd gone through the process, dealing with the commissioner, there's all these meetings, we're getting near the final end of deliberations, and somebody slides a letter across the table in one of our private meetings right before the announcements came out and said, well, the community of one of the local bases has said they actually want to close the thing. Jaws floor meat. What? There are communities that actually, the federal government owns some of the best real estate in the world. Just go to a Nats game, okay? And look out, and or take the baseball boat, I should say, over there. Now, that's just one example where you could just survey communities and find out what else is out there. Another, and start your BRAC list there, right? As opposed to just trying to fight the uphill battle that's a loser. There are other ways, of course, there are other potential ways to do it. There could be a focus that's on, to your point, the public-private partnerships, but you can't probably assume the old model will work.
Questions right over here?
Hi, Kathy Roth-Duquet with Blue Star Families. Phil, I appreciate you raising the issue of the all-volunteer force. I think because of the nature of today's military, we don't have the luxury of sticking with the status quo force or the way things have been done in the past. Today's military is millennial. It's increasingly female. Millennials marry people of educational and achievement levels. And what we're seeing at Blue Star Families, what our annual survey shows, is the number one factor for people making decisions whether to continue to volunteer in the military is the effect it's having on their families, including their spouses and their children, but particularly their overall family economic well-being in a society where most families need two incomes to work, and that's an increasingly difficult thing to field. Secretary Hagel told me on his last day in office that he had had breakfast with 6 West Point captains, 5 of whom were leaving service because they felt continuing to stay would hurt their family. And I see a number of people here in this room who also left service for that reason. So to what degree will military reform consider personnel reform that allows our millennial force who want to serve find ways to continue to do so that they feel doesn't disadvantage their families to the degree compared to other Americans who are similarly situated? Thanks.
It's a great question. I think 3 quick points. One, The familyification of our force, for lack of a better term, is a major trend in the last 40 years. It used to be if the military wanted you to have a spouse, they'd issue you one. Now, 54% or so of today's service members have a spouse. The majority of those have children. So this is a significant part of the force. Second, we can't plan for millennials. We have to begin planning for post-millennials and post-millennials. And it takes so long to do anything in the Defense Department that by the time we plan for millennials, they'll be on the Joint Chiefs. So we've got to think about something that's broader. Third, I think it's the system that matters, not so much the particular responses of the system to surveys. So we've designed a system based on a particular family model that existed in the US in the mid-20th century. The system of constant churn, of geographic dislocation, of other things that are incidental to the warfighting mission of deployment is something we should look at. And we should think about a system that takes into account perhaps a slower churn, less geographic movement, and the rest of society's direction with respect to geographic mobility when we think about the future design of the force.
And you know, healthcare obviously is one of the most important benefits to anyone staying in any organization, including the defense world. And when you look for all the money, I talked earlier about how much more money we're spending and how much it's actually going up faster than the private sector. And for all that money, the satisfaction is actually very low in many ways. You know, the TRICARE networks are often have poor satisfaction. Often military treatment facilities have trouble with staffing and access. And so for all the money we're spending, we're actually not delivering the satisfaction. So we need to take a look at what we can do to not only improve the value, to improve the total value, not just lower the cost, right? How do we improve the quality of this? And this gets to that conversation about how do we look at different ways to purchase care than discounted fee-for-service? Because when you have discount fee-for-service, you only have a blunt instrument to control cost, and that's to lower the reimbursement. And you get to that floor where it's very hard to put a network together. So how do you look at alternative payment models as a key part of the strategy to control defense health costs? How do we look at, when we have a military treatment facility, optimizing that fixed resource? You already have the fixed budget. If you don't optimize the variable budget by optimizing the utilization of that fixed resource, you're wasting money. And by the way, it's a lot cheaper to give care there than to buy it downtown. So there's a whole, we need a strategic look at how we improve the value of defense healthcare. And I choose the word value and not lower the cost, because we have to lower the cost. That's necessary but not sufficient. We have to improve the quality and the satisfaction among our defense beneficiaries and make that a good buy in terms of money, and improve that satisfaction to retain that fighting force.
And Michelle, you've worked and you're going to work more on Force of the Future. There are several good recommendations in Force of the Future for on-ramps and off-ramps, for continuum of service, so that we can get right to your point of let's make this a very workable proposition for our military members. It's got to happen, or we're going to find ourselves in a huge intellectual deficit, because our best and brightest will probably find another way to survive and get out.
All right, we have time for one more. So who wants to get that last question?
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Senator McCain has indicated that next year he's going to make a big push for TRICARE reform, but as you know, next year is also an election year. And TRICARE reform is obviously a very sensitive political topic. Do you anticipate that lawmakers will be willing to make any major changes in the TRICARE system to help DoD save money, or will they just kick the can down the road because that's just too difficult to do politically? Thanks.
You're the healthcare guy.
Want to go for that, Steve?
I would love to believe that they would take this on in an election year. I'm not overly optimistic, but I think that we can start the conversation.
And there's another opportunity on the horizon, which is the large TRICARE procurement, which is coming up, I believe, in 2017.
Right.
And so what may happen is that Congress is able to shape the environment by holding hearings and possibly dictating policy language in the next NDAA that shapes that procurement, and possibly even go so far as to put value-based procurement on the table as a legislative mandate.
Yeah, I think that's one that they can do now. And then on the benefit design piece and some of the copay deductible and that share, I think that's one that you start the conversation on. I think it'd be very hard to pass that piece. I think what Phil talked about is doable now.
All right, it's lunchtime. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Good job. Very well done.